It must suck getting shipwrecked.
That's very astute of you. Have you made a study?
But you know, I reckon it would be, you'd feel extra miffed, extra pissed off if the place where you get shipwrecked, you couldn't even see.
What?
You know, coral reefs that are underneath the water.
So you mean like you just suddenly stop in the water for no reason and your boat doesn't work?
You just suddenly stop.
Okay.
So in the waters of the South Pacific, about 500 kilometres southwest of Tonga, there's a small series of coral reefs that sit just a few feet, a few metres underneath the waterline. And for years, they've taken out boats. The whaler Minerva, that's what they were named for a long time, in 1829. Before that, there was the Spanish brig Rosalia in 1807, the Caroline in 1859. This was after the reefs had been charted by this point. So at least the Spanish, you know, they didn't know they were there. So fair point.
It's because it's all written in English.
This is 1859. They didn't know Caroline got hit. Okay. The Libelle, 1866, the Strathcona, 1915, and the Tongan cutter, Taikapau, in 1962. Now, for a ship's captain, that would be like, oh, this is super treacherous. You go through there and you could just run into a reef all of a sudden without knowing. But if you look at the world a little bit differently, maybe these just below the surface of the water reefs aren't danger, but the best opportunity in the world. Michael Oliver had a pretty rough start to his life. He was born named Moses Olitsky in Kaunas, Lithuania, 1928. And his first 12 years were probably fine. Kaunas itself looks like a quaint little city, and it's been described as sort of an Eastern European version of Casablanca or Beirut. You know, it's a melting pot. But in 1940, the war arrived and nothing would be the same. First, the city was occupied by the Soviets, and then a year later, it was occupied by the Germans. And the Germans, of course, rounded up the city's Jews. They killed or raped and killed thousands right away, while forcing others, including the young Moses, to go and live in the ghetto on the outskirts of the city.
Bad name to have in those circumstances.
Yeah. And in 1944, the residents of the ghetto on the outskirts of the city were shipped first to the Stutthof concentration camp and then to another camp at Dachau, and then finally on the Nazi death march, where lots and lots would have died. Moses Olitsky was kind of lucky. He was liberated by US troops while on the death march in 1945 when he was 17. 17. So remember, this is between the age of 12 and 17, all this is going on for him.
It wouldn't affect your psychological development, though. Almost no impact, I'm guessing.
His family weren't. All four of his siblings and both of his parents had been murdered. 2 years later, Moses Olitsky picked himself up. He emigrated to the US. He changed his name to Michael Oliver, became a naturalized American, joined the Air Force. He got out of the Air Force after a few years and he started a family in Carson City, Nevada, and became rich selling land and gold and silver coins. But even while he put down roots, his wartime fears remained. Could the US, you know, the land of the free, could it slip into the totalitarianism that he saw in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany?
That is obviously impossible.
Well, he didn't think it was impossible and he wanted an escape plan.
Oh, what a catastrophist. I mean, all evidence suggests it's going to be fine.
Minerva Reef beckoned. August 1971. After a series of other plans and work building a team and some collaborators, Michael Oliver, that's Moses Olitsky now, began the arduous process of building a brand new island in the Southwest Pacific. A bunch of his collaborators came down onto those dangerous reefs and began erecting some mounds. They got some coral, wrapped it up in chicken wire, covered in cement, and dumped it on the coral reefs. And they put up some vertical markers, well, flagpoles, I guess they would be, that rose to 26 feet above the ocean.
Like 1 metre?
It's 9 metres or so.
That's what I meant.
At the top of which they put up their flag for the Republic of Minerva. And he'd already planned his whole republic. He had a constitution, roughly modelled on the US Constitution. Now remember, this is a tiny little atoll, like of nothing. It's got an executive, legislative, and just judicial branch, local, regional, and national government.
Yes, you definitely need 3 levels of government. It's perfect.
A military. But there would be some key differences between his Republic of Minerva and the US. Now, there'd be no welfare. There'd be no printing money and no ability to levy taxes. And so if you wanted a government service, you know, whether it's the police or something like that, you got to pay for it.
Oh, like, I'm getting murdered. Can we have your credit card details?
I think literally that. They mailed a letter to 100 governments around the world inviting recognition of the Republic's existence and sovereignty.
Sure, we don't care. This isn't going to last. Do what you want.
So what I want to explore today is what that was all about. What happened? What was the thinking behind this? And to do that, I've brought in an expert today, one of the people who's writing on the idea of libertarians escaping to distant islands. I've just found fascinating. So I want to introduce Professor Raymond B. Craib. Raymond is the Marie Underhill Dole Professor of History at Cornell University and author of the excellent Adventure Capitalism, a history of libertarian exit from the era of decolonization to the digital age. Ray, welcome to The Wholesome Show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm going to pause on the Republic of Minerva because I want to come back to there later. Ray, you've been collecting stories of libertarians escaping from the rest of the world. What brought you to doing this kind of research?
So, I'm a historian who was trained to work in Latin America, and that's where most of my work has been, is in Mexico and in Chile. And I totally came to this project unexpectedly. My wife grew up in Hawaii and is a very avid outrigger canoe paddler. And so I got into outrigger canoe paddling. And one summer, we had a canoe club here in upstate New York on the lake. And we took a group of kids out, teenagers who were doing summer camp stuff. And we figured, hey, well, we'll teach them to outrigger canoe paddle. And we'll go out to the middle of the lake. And each time I'll give like a little 10-minute talk about the history of outrigger canoe paddling. And so I started to do some research on it. And I came across a variety of these strange cases of people trying to build some kind of libertarian society on the ocean. The one that initially I came across was seasteading, which this is the sort of effort by Milton Friedman's grandson, Patrick Friedman, with funding from Peter Thiel to famous Silicon Valley iconoclast, to create some kind of libertarian platform, independent sovereign platform on the open ocean. And I got, I just went down a rabbit hole.
How many degrees of separation is there between I want to learn a little bit about outrigger canoe paddling and libertarian icon islands? I mean, I feel like you must have gone down quite a long rabbit hole, or was it like 1-2 steps there?
Maybe 3 steps. It wasn't that many steps, surprisingly enough. In part because the thing that was so interesting to me was the assumption on the part of the people that I started writing about that the ocean was just out there for them to take, with no recognition of, these long histories of long distance voyaging and so forth on the part of a lot of people who are native to Oceania. And so just the whole assumption that they could just go colonize the ocean to me was bizarre and fascinating and twisted. And so that was the rabbit hole showed up pretty quickly. Yeah.
Wow. Well, once you're a historian, you never clock off, obviously.
No, that's right.
When you're doing your side research on outrigger canoes, you get to the seastead. So tell us, the seasteads, how did it pop up for you? You Googled outrigger canoe history and...
straight to Peter Thiel.
Yeah, everything goes straight to Peter Thiel these days in some form. Part of the way it came about was starting to look at some of the longer histories of writing about seeing the ocean as a form of territory, seeing the ocean as not some kind of separation between people, but a conduit, a thing that connects people in different kinds of ways. And I don't know where it popped up, but at some point the seasteading popped up, and being a historian, I wanted to go back in time a little bit because it seems like there's a tendency to think that somehow or another the Silicon Valley tech bros invented everything from scratch, and I wanted to be able to show that there's a long history to a lot of these kinds of ideas and projects.
So how far back do you go with that history? Where are the sort of origin stories, if you think of it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could go back quite a long ways, even to kind of thinking about, things like company states and Wakefield and the colonization projects of the 16th and 17th century, More's Utopia. I ended up going back to the 50s and the 60s, 1950s and 1960s, just to kind of keep some sort of manageability to the project, but also because I felt like the libertarian side of things really sort of takes off in the 1950s and the 1960s after World War II. And I was interested in this kind of U.S. style, market libertarianism or market authoritarianism, if you want to refer to it that way. And so I ended up starting in the 1950s and the 1960s, and that's when I came across. I came across Oliver. I came across a few other people as well who were doing projects like this in the 50s and the 60s too.
I like the story of Ernest Hemingway's little brother.
Yeah, Lester Hemingway.
Lester? This is my brother, Les. Can he write? Not through with shit.
No, well, I don't know. Maybe.
But man, can he, what is it, rope soft drink bottles together and make a floating island?
Not far off, not far off. So what was Lester's story?
Well, so this was 1964, and it's a bit of a crazy story, but he basically took this raft and he put a Ford engine block as an anchor, and he anchored it off the coast of Jamaica just far enough out so that it would be considered international waters. And then he declared the birth of the Republic of Atlantis. Atlantis is this kind of, all the libertarians keep naming things Atlantis. And he called it the Republic of Atlantis, and he did some interesting things. He made his own currency out of shells and cockles and things like this. He made his own postage stamps. And then he also encouraged birds to defecate on one end of the raft, and then he ceded that portion of the raft to the United States under the 1856 Guano Islands Act.
Nice. By
suggesting that because of the guano, it could be part of the U.S., and then the remainder of the raft would be his own kind of private independent country. And
I love how these dudes, they start with currency. You don't have an economy of any description except for some bird shit on the end of your raft. You make postage stamps. Like, what about, I don't know, food, sanitation, a roof? It just sounds funny to me. They always go to the glorious stuff first. Like, here's some badges. Here's a noble order that the government can hand out
and
to
a flag.
Dignified citizens.
A flag. Always got to have a flag. Yeah. Hemingway, I think, I don't want to call it a goof or a prank, but there was a tongue-in-cheek component to it. He had stamps that he dedicated to, Lady Bird Johnson, Lyndon Johnson's wife. And things like this. But I think he kind of lived in the shadow of his brother, and so was looking to kind of make a name for himself in some ways.
What a way to do it. So you said he was wiped out by a hurricane. How long was he out on his birdshit island?
Not long at all. I think it was less than 2 years.
That's not bad. That's not bad. I think it's say 2 weeks.
I have lived on a raft for a lot less than that, and
yes, you have.
I think 2 years is somewhat of a heroic effort. I know that I'll ask in a second. There might be some that have lasted longer.
I'd probably be a bit miffed after day 3.
It wasn't 2 weeks, but he didn't last any longer than 2 years. I'm not quite sure how long he lasted. I can't recall off the top of my head, but he had other people with him, so he had a kind of agent or person that worked with him and their partner. And then he also had some of his own family members there for a little while as well. But it's basically off the coast, the northern coast of Jamaica, that he put this together. And then that was the end of it. And he didn't try to kind of rebuild or do anything after that.
I'm guessing he wasn't a billionaire either, so he didn't really have the same kind of resources.
No.
Yeah.
No, that's right. Yeah.
I feel like you need a few bucks to kick our country off.
It doesn't sound to me, though, that the billionaire plans are a million miles away from a raft of plastic bottles screwed together.
Right. In some ways, they're aspirational, and in other ways, I think, at times they're just a grift. They're kind of new forms of venture capitalism, new ways to raise money. And at other times, you've got people who just have so much disposable income that they're willing to sink a little bit into anything that might possibly yield some kind of results down the line. But I think in every instance, these things have been a bit of a train wreck, and they haven't been good for the populations of the places where they are experimented, where they're tried out.
We kind of live in one. Canberra is kind of like that, but on land. It's an entirely created city in the middle of nowhere.
It's not a libertarian city, though.
No, but it didn't naturally form. So we're kind of like an island on a bunch of bottles with a fake lake, and we didn't. And so it can work. Okay. It can work. Okay. 200, is it 200 years? 200 years. 100
not in
years.
Canberra, 100 years.
100 years, I can't tell. So we're proof it works, except not floating.
Well, what is the longest lived version that you've seen? Either an island or a boat or a raft or something like that, or any of these sort of libertarianist type projects. What's the one that has stuck around?
I think probably the best example, and the one that listeners might be most familiar with, is Sealand, and that's the oil rig platform off the coast of England, off the coast of Suffolk, and that was the Bates family. And they declared themselves royalty, and they took it over. And I mean, that's got a wild story, and it's been around since the 1960s. And they've issued passports, and there was some controversy around the passports being used in slightly nefarious ways. And there have been efforts by people to raid the platform and kind of take it over. And but that one's had a lot of longevity, certainly 40 years or more. I'm not even sure if Sealand is operating anymore, but it's certainly had a long shelf life. Let's put it that way.
40 years or more, though. Whoa, that's impressive. Well done, Sealand, if you still exist.
I think psychologically, I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask is the characteristics of the people that are doing this. And psychologically, to cut yourself off from mainstream society for 40 years deliberately it certainly marks you out as a certain type of person. But who are the people that are doing this?
Yeah, a lot of the people I look at, especially from the 1960s and the 1970s, some of them have, a circumstance like Michael Oliver's. There's others who had similar stories to his. Their families had been persecuted by the Nazis or by Stalinist Russia. And so they were essentially worried about totalitarianism. They were fearful that the circumstances within which they lived might change at any moment, and they wanted an escape hatch. You also have a lot of people, though, who are embracing a much more kind of radical form of anti-government politics in the 1950s and the 1960s. I mean, the backers of Michael Oliver are very interesting. One was a man by the name of Willard Garvey, who was a wheat magnate from Wichita Falls, Kansas, in the U.S. A very, very wealthy man, had a kind of direct connection, direct line to the head of the CIA in the 1950s. There's correspondence between the two of them. He also was an advocate for basically turning as many people as possible into a homeowner. His line to the director of the CIA was, instead of every man a communist, every man a capitalist, and the way to make them a capitalist is to make them a homeowner. He was a huge fan of Oliver's booklet, this little book that he wrote, A New Constitution for a New Country. John Templeton, who was an investment guy on Wall Street and still prominent these days with the Templeton Foundation. You have an array of people who, they're opposed to mid-20th century U.S. welfare state.
Yep.
And what they're doing is they are organizing and collaborating and experimenting and seeing what they can do. And they're doing it in the midst of, the formation of offshore financial centers and tax havens. So they've got a kind of model in front of them. And then they're also doing it in the high era of decolonization. And so they're thinking to themselves, all these places are breaking away from colonial rule, and there might be opportunities for us. I don't think they ever saw themselves as purposefully, totally isolating themselves.
Yeah, okay.
I think what they thought they were doing was, in some sense, creating a kind of better, newer form of government with like-minded people. So something like a homeowner association, right? A condo, basically, a kind of homeowner association in a place that would be amenable to the kinds of things that you mentioned at the outset, right? These kind of contractual relations where everything comes under sort of private contract and mechanisms, market mechanisms.
I'm not going to lie. I'm a little disappointed. I was hoping you're going to say these guys are fucking bonkers. Like they're 9/10 of them are insane. They've got these crazy ideas. Everyone has to have 9 cats. Like, are any of them nuts?
The individuals I look at in the 50s and the 60s and 70s, while I'm not a fan of their ideas, I think I can understand kind of where they're coming from.
Okay.
The more contemporary stuff, so seasteading, free private cities in Honduras, charter cities, cryogenics, and longevity ideas that a lot of the Silicon Valley characters have. The newer stuff, I just think it is kind of bonkers. And I also think these are things that it's hard for me to kind of see where they don't come from any place of someone having been deprived or having suffered or having been concerned about totalitarianism, in my opinion. I mean, these are things that come from hubris, from ego, from a sense of being, much more elevated than the rest of us.
Yep.
And so that kind of, the more recent kind of stuff that I write about at the end of my book, the last 2 chapters are dedicated to these more contemporary projects that are still ongoing. And those things I have very, very little patience for whatsoever. And I try to express that in the book. The tone of the book changes at the end. Yeah.
One of the things I've been grappling with in thinking about these sorts of projects is, there's how we think about the ethics of allowing it, how much we as a society should do it. And you said you're not a fan of some of their ideas, but you can find some sort of justice in some of them. And I don't know, have you watched the recent show Silo?
No, I haven't.
A science fiction show, and it's set on a recent book, but basically about a completely contained society. They live in a bunker under the ground, where one of the main rules is everyone can exit if they want, but once you exit, you're gone, and there is no connection. And a part of me says, surely we should always allow people to exit from society. If you want to go, then everyone has the right to leave. But then I also worry about, what do these, if we allow people to go and set up these other free societies or things like that, are they parasitical on the rest of us?
Also, who polices it though? If you say no, we don't allow it, but then they float it just off the international waters of Jamaica, who's the boss?
Yeah.
The thing that I think is interesting about the exit question is, my tendency would be to agree with you, right? You don't want to restrict people from moving, but of course we restrict people from entering all the time. I mean, so exit seems somehow or another a given, but entrance doesn't. And I think there's an imbalance there to begin with. I think it's a structural imbalance that replicates the structural inequalities around us. But I also wonder to myself, how much does a society, a community, put into somebody that then they can just bugger off? I mean, I don't know if that's. I mean, there's a real problem there, also. And so there's one of the texts that I mentioned at the end of the book that I found very interesting was a book. His name, the author's name, I'm trying to remember. I think it's Jeffrey Friedman. But one of the cases that he makes is that exit is something that should be a fundamental right, and yet at the same token, the idea of exit without first and foremost giving everybody equal access to the possibility of exiting. Is one of the things that needs to happen first. I mean, I mentioned in my book the song or the poem from Gil Heron, right, Whitey on the Moon, in which his poem is essentially pointing out that there's all this hubbub and hurrah in the late 1960s because the U.S. government has landed somebody on the moon, which is, now with Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, has become another kind of form of libertarian exit. And yet in the meantime, you have, people down here on planet Earth who can't afford housing, can't afford food, can't find work. There's a complete neglect, right, of the basic reality of society.
Growing up, I'm a fan of going to space. I think it's cool. You read all the science fiction things, but I always when I get closer down to thinking about colony on the moon, colony on Mars, particularly when it's funded by a billionaire or some sort of thing like that. Now, of course, that's hypothetical, but it's just the idea of escaping and leaving all of us behind to clean up the mess. And it kind of makes me angry, this idea that, you can just escape global warming, but you've caused a lot of it.
That's right. And I think, this is the thing. On the one hand, to me, a lot of these projects are just bonkers, and I don't see any of them coming to fruition. Maybe some of the ones that are kind of on land, like in Central America, I can talk about those in a few minutes. I mean, those I think are of more immediate concern, but these long-term, sort of outer space and colonizing the open ocean and this kind of stuff, I mean, I doubt they'll ever come to fruition. But I also think the issue with these is not that the sort of big grand scheme of the project happens, but instead, in the process of exploring it, these characters find little cracks and fissures in the system and gradually do abandon the rest of us, gradually do take their money. It's like they take their ball and they go home from the playground, but they take their money and they protect themselves and they hunker down for themselves. And the rest of us, are struggling to basically get basic needs met through some sense of commitment to the public.
And also, you know, as you mentioned, Ray, the floating island talks about this. The labourers go home at the end of the day. That you need labour. Like there is no society that is just billionaires.
Right. Robots.
If you're all okay, maybe they get to a place where they've got robots that are self-perpetuating or something like that. But if you're all just billionaires and there's no labour, then I don't think anything works.
My toilet is dirty. Will you clean it for me? I shall not.
How do you get the 100 millionaire to clean your toilet if you're the billionaire?
You offer him $1 billion.
The seasteaders, who I mentioned, I mean, that started up in 2008 with a $500,000 sort of angel investment from Peter Thiel. And, you know, their logo is Burning Man on the ocean, right? So it's very much kind of, you know, there's this sort of Burning Man.
That should be fine.
Yes.
That should be sustainable.
Isn't that current Burning Man? Is Burning Man on the ocean? I don't know.
Yeah, there's a whole sort of irony there too. But but this is exactly it. I mean, I think there's all these international legal questions about some kind of seastead on the high seas, so to speak. And then there's the engineering questions, you know, a whole bunch of, you know, a billion little Coke bottles or whatever. But the big question is labor, right? It's social reproduction. I mean, how do you get the laborers out there? I mean, it's way out in the middle of nowhere. You're going to be, by sheer virtue of what it is that you want to construct, you have to be far enough away from the exclusive economic zones of a whole lot of island nations and archipelagos. And so the labor costs are exorbitant, right? And this is why the seasteaders have moved closer to shore.
We're going to have floating or towed floating ghettos, right? That's obviously the next solution. You make a shitty version that sort of trails behind the main one. That's where the workers get corralled.
Well, it is. I mean, you do get these shadow cities, right? You mentioned Canberra, and I mean, Brasilia was also a capital city built from scratch in Brazil in the 1950s. And that was exactly what happened. You had Brasilia nice and shiny, and then right next to Brasilia, you had Workers Brasilia, where all the workers were encamped to build Brasilia. Yeah.
Of course, you know, you design some utopia, and they're not, you know, Brasilia is not aimed to be a libertarian exit city, but designed to be some sort of nation-state utopia type thing. But you've marginalized other bits, the labor, the things that aren't there. I always think one of the other versions of libertarian exit, which is not designed by billionaires, is the Kowloon walled city in Hong Kong, which was a hyper dense due to like local laws didn't apply or something weird, and it became completely anarchic from a very different direction.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I mentioned and that I try to make a distinction between is the libertarian projects that I look at and some of the kinds of projects that you just mentioned. Which do have a more, first of all, they're more organic. They're not top-down planned. They don't have a kind of a constitution written in advance by one person who's basically going to, declare by fiat what's going to happen. And they also they grow organic from the bottom up. I think they tend to be organized. I mean, and I don't want to romanticize this, but certainly I think they tend to be organized a little bit more around questions of solidarity and community. You have a lot of different kinds of versions of this over history, maroon communities of escaped slaves. These are exit projects in some form or another. The Zapatistas in southern Mexico today. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of examples one could look at. But to me, those are extraordinarily different than the projects that I'm looking at, which really come from the moneyed class. They're top down, they're engineered, they're very ideologically driven as well. I mean, a part of this is about, making a point. And so the seasteaders have said, for example, maybe these will never come to fruition, but maybe in the process, all different kinds of new, let 1,000 ideas bloom and new kinds of things might happen. And these might rebound back on to existing nation states and force them to compete to keep their citizenship. I mean, it's all about competition, right? And I think that's the kind of distinction I would make between these different kinds of projects. But you're right, there's a whole kind of spectrum of these.
And there seems to be, and maybe I'm smelling a false dichotomy here, but the ones that are extremely intentional, ideological, et cetera, as you put it, and the ones that just kind of morph out of necessity. So you say the free slaves situation, et cetera. Is it that clear usually? There are people who've had a thought bubble in their, solid gold bathtub and said, let's do it. And the people have gone, fuck, if we don't do this, we're screwed and we're going to die, so we must.
These are projects that are they're real estate speculative investments, right? They're kind of like crypto or Bitcoin. I mean, they're speculative investments, and they're designed a little bit like a kind of multi-level marketing scheme like Amway. I mean, it's essentially an effort to kind of get more people to invest and to raise money and get enough people interested and enough people investing, and you think you can bring something to fruition. But of course, once it really has to take shape, once it really has to start, the sort of practical realities of putting these things together, then it begins to fall apart. The shell game comes apart.
Yeah, the multi-level marketing similarity is dangerous. I mean, if you've got a finite land space and you rely on always bringing in new people, I mean, you get your labour solved for a while at the bottom of the pile, but you can't have infinite growth.
Well, I like the other version of this, that some of the critiques of Zuckerberg's metaverse is that, in the crypto sense, you're trying to bring people in to make a new version of land or something like that. That what we've got here is the same sort of thing where we're inventing a new spaces that are controlled in a different way from somewhere else, but they don't tend to work, even when you're completely technological.
The sort of most direct critique, or the most direct way I can accentuate what I think is the foolhardiness of these, is that they derive their inspiration from Ayn Rand. I just think that basically kind of sums it up. I mean, a lot of them they'll name themselves after characters in Rand novels. So in Chile, twice they tried to put together something called a Galt's Gulch, Chile, named after, the sort of place where all the capitalist class, the managerial class, were going to escape to and just hang out in the Rockies while society collapsed around them. But of course, it's ridiculous because the laborers are still around, and so society will keep going. But in the meantime, thankfully, the managerial class has gone away. I mean, and so it's this kind of weird inverse universe she creates where she thinks that this all looks like a good thing for them to escape and let society collapse. But in reality, it's good that they're just gone and out of the picture.
This is Douglas Adams, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, did this, He took the middle strata and sent them off to what ended up becoming Earth. Like all the middle managers, the phone sanitizers and stuff got put on these ark ships and sent away, and it turns out that's how humanity developed on this planet.
Well, there's all these kinds of projects named after this stuff, and some of them have had a long lifespan. I mean, the ones in Chile didn't last very long at all because the founders didn't understand Chilean land law, they didn't understand water rights and all this kind of stuff, and everybody had to buy in with Bitcoin, and it kind of fell apart. But the same person involved in that went off to Acapulco in Mexico and then started this Anarchapulco annual gathering of libertarians in this big kind of festival atmosphere. It was doing okay for a while just as a kind of gathering and as a kind of community for a couple of years when Bitcoin was worth a lot of money. But then when Bitcoin collapsed, I mean, things started to fall apart and the whole thing kind of fragmented. But there's just it's iterations of these things over and over and over again. And part of it, I think, is simply it's a business model of raising money. Yeah.
So, having looked at a lot of them, if you were to give advice to these people, if they actually wanted to succeed, maybe to raise money, yes, but to actually succeed in this vision, what would be the things that you'd say to them?
What would I say to them? Don't do it. I mean, these are, vanity projects. You want to take them seriously at some level and think about what it is that motivates people. And I realize, for some of these people, they do think that the state is ultimately a repressive institution. They do think there are better ways of organizing society. They do think there are better ways of providing a wide array of different kinds of options and choices and so on and so forth. I mean, choice is the kind of core part of their vocabulary. It's rooted in a profit motive. And so there's always this conflict between the profit motive and what they claim. It's the whole thing, like the classic line, we're going to do really good work in the world and make a lot of money while we're doing it. And it's not entirely clear to me that those things line up very often, if at all. And so these kinds of projects, I mean, the other projects I look at in my book, I mean, Michael Oliver, his story is a good one for people to be aware of, because after the Minerva Reef, he tries his hand with a group of pretty sketchy characters in the Bahamas and tries to set up a kind of private community or private country in Abaco in the Bahamas. And he's involved with some people who have some pretty shady backgrounds and are involved in the kind of war machine of weaponry and silencers and munitions and things like this. And then he ends up in Vanuatu on the island of Santo. His activities end up aiding in the fomentation of a rebellion on the island of Santo that has serious consequences for Ni Vanuatu, for native people of Vanuatu, including some deaths, lots of displacement, a kind of delay in independence, a lot of complications. To my mind, I mean, these things should be at some level an indication of the pretty dire consequences that result from these kinds of experiments, that people just assume they have the right to experiment. The stuff in Honduras today, I just find appalling. I think it's completely unethical and irresponsible. And they're now running into trouble.
I think, when you're talking about that Venn diagram of the type of people, you mentioned there is some of this ideological belief, that a belief about the state and being able to exit and how states should be organized. Then there's that profit motive. But then you also put in those sketchy characters. I don't doubt there are many of the sketchier ends of the world who don't want to be part of society because they want to do things that mostly in society we don't agree with. And so
that's right.
That they're a terrible group of people to put together. And then their cares for the rest of the world, their cares for native peoples and societies around them seem to be very shallow. So
my guess is, though, for these sketchy people, I'm guessing, again, speaking of Venn diagrams, that I want to remove myself from society and just straight up sketchy people looking for cash. Probably quite small. I guess most of them just are sketchy people looking for cash, and this is just same shit, different shovel.
At some level, yeah. I mean, there's more of the sort of I'm looking for cash kind of aspect to this. I mean, I wanted to stress this in part because I think there's a tendency sometimes to separate out the kind of, market fundamentalism of U.S. libertarianism, which has now become, strangely commonplace. I guess it shouldn't be strange, actually. But anyway, it's become kind of commonplace here that, the progression since the 1970s in the United States in this way has been kind of horrifying to watch. So there's a tendency to kind of separate that out from things like, the war machine and privatized war industries and conservative politics writ large. And I don't think those things should be separated out because I think what the material I look at shows, at least, is that these are not necessarily strange bedfellows. There's a lot of shared sympathy. I used to get complaints when I first started writing this stuff. I'd every once in a while get an email from somebody who was linked up with, the Silicon Valley ecosystem saying, why are you calling us conservatives? We're not conservatives, and why are you calling us right wing? And, and my response to them was actually like, sit down and work through it.
If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck,
you'll figure it out. And so because there's a sort of, at times, a kind of what they see as a socially progressive aspect to this, right? So, polyamory, like getting rid of ridiculous drug laws and so forth. I totally agree. Drug laws have been a total disaster for this country, but the people involved in these projects, none of those people are subject to persecution by the drug laws in this country. They're too wealthy and they're too white. Right? They're not going to be the ones suffering because of the drug laws in this country. So there's this kind of weird narrative about themselves, about how they're persecuted and victims and so on and so forth, and the state does this and the state does that, and it's hard to buy.
Can I just, before we lose that point, is there much of an intersect, this could be a very naive question, with the whole private prison? I can feel a lot of common smell around this. It wouldn't take much to turn private prison mentality and profit margin into special little islands for people.
One of the troubling things for me as I kind of finished the book was a realization that on the one hand, there is something real and concrete in talking about exit with these characters. And yet at the same time, they're not exiting at all. I think what is happening in part is the state has, government, the state itself has now become the new, grounds upon which to make money. And so the enormous growth in private contractors and replacing the military in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, you look at the development of Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., and its entire growth is built around a privatized military economy. And prisons, of course, are a very good example, as are detention centers for people who are unauthorized or undocumented in the country. There's a vested interest on the part of these private companies to make sure that people are constantly being detained and denied their rights because they get paid per bed basis.
So that's a frighteningly close link then to an even more nefarious side of it. I mean, are we going to set up these floating islands for such purposes rather than the
well, the UK are doing that at the moment with refugee policy. But
right.
you know the other pop culture thing that I keep thinking about here, a few years back, The Wire, where it is the opposite group of people, you know, people that are black people in Baltimore that are absolutely constrained in their lives by the state. You know, the state is all around them. Police forces are all around them, making sure that they are barely able to move. And the options for them, as portrayed in The Wire, are tiny. You know, these are communities where the only things that they can do really is getting involved in the drug trade or something like that. And yet it seems so much that, you know, for them, exit or moving out of society might be an option. I don't know, or being able to leave. But these white billionaires, you know, have so many of these freedoms, and yet they still feel persecuted.
Yeah, The Wire. I mean, it is. I mean, on so many levels, right? The way it sort of deconstructs City Hall, you know, and dock workers, and I mean, it is such an amazing show. And so, yeah, at some level, I mean, thinking about back to the earlier question about other forms of kind of exit that are more organic or from below, I mean, there's other kinds of examples one could think of here in which, you know, communities of solidarity and mutual aid that just want the state to kind of stay out, right? And those are not ones that I spend a lot of time talking about. I would sort of differentiate, not just differentiate them from the libertarian exiteers that I talk about, based on things like top-down engineering and wealth access and so on and so forth. But I would also separate them out in terms of what their long-term relationship is to the state or to government. I mean, at some level, you're exactly right. Where are people going to go? And so it's a matter of figuring out what kinds of social relations, what kind of relationships you build, what kind of small-scale economies you build, in order to, you know, have some sense, right, of being able to keep the state or the worst aspects of the state at bay. The libertarian exiteers that I'm looking at, their relationship is much more embedded, right? They still want patent law. They still want their property rights protected. Mm-hmm. They still want some kind of police force. And so in some ways, they're much more embedded in the state. And that's why I was saying at some level, I think exit is almost a misnomer, right? It's a kind of reworking of power and government. So
they can be more central to it, have more of that and less for the other. I liked one of your conclusions about Michael Oliver in the constitution he was setting up in the Minerva case, that he was roughly an absolutist king rather than being, you know, first in a democratic sense. You know, we're setting up an actual republic. And so, you know, what it was is very much that he was the top of the pyramid and controlled these power relations.
Yes, by your freedom, I mean mine.
I mean, that's the irony, right, is there's this kind of top-down component to something that espouses, you know, very loudly freedom, right? The idea of some kind of idea of freedom. But what that means, and I mean, this is an ongoing conversation. I mean, discussions around freedom in the 1970s and the 1980s, you know, there's been these economists and others who are very sort of defensive or protective of the projects that I write about, who tend, you know, they suggest that freedom basically means freedom of the marketplace, and it doesn't matter about democratic politics. And so they take an example like Chile, where, you know, the most radical privatization and the most radical neoliberal reforms were put into place by an authoritarian government, and they don't necessarily see a contradiction there. And I raised that point in part because, you know, 2 days ago or 3 days ago, September 11th was the 50th anniversary of the coup that overthrew Allende. And then in 75, you started to see the Chicago Boys and Milton Friedman and Hayek and von Mises begin to essentially dismantle the social economy, the economy of Chile, and to radically privatize it all. And then they formalized it in a dictatorial constitution from 1980.
So we've had, since at least the 1980s with Reagan and Thatcher, but you can see throughout the 20th century a wave of more libertarian emphasis in governments around the world, reduction in the power of the state as opposed to the power of the market. How do we stop that? How do we stop it from billionaires raising more state capacity to help them to make their lives easier? How do the rest of us claw some of that power back?
Love-in, man. We just have a love-in. Show them the way.
Lobbying. Yeah, it's a good question, and this is always one of those moments where I'm allowed a kind of default exit of my own by saying, well, I'm a historian, and I look at the past, and so I can sort of skirt the question. But I do think that government's serious. I mean, it's serious business, not business in the business sense, in the market sense, but it's like, it's a serious activity, and it's been such ever since Reagan and Thatcher, and certainly even prior. But this idea, right, that government's the problem and government has to get out of the way, and so on and so forth, and the idea that you're going to leave people to the whims of, does anybody really want to live in a community governed by Elon Musk or Zuckerberg or Bezos? I mean,
not even they want to live there. If they actually experienced it, to be like, why are all these bumps on the road outside my house? It's because of you dead shit.
Maybe if they weren't personally so awful, maybe they could convince other people. You get a nice version of them setting it up. I don't know. That's not enough.
So I think, it's I mean, it's a very good question. But I also feel like there's a lot of work to do in the writing that people are doing and the research that people are doing to actually call into question a lot of the trends and trajectories that have been taking place over the last 40 years or so, at least rhetorically, because again, I mean, the rhetoric has been very anti-government, but when you look at the size of states, the budgets of states, who's involved with them, the kinds of things that they're doing, it's not like the state's gone anywhere or is going anywhere anytime soon, but it's been reconfigured to benefit a very few at the expense of the many.
Damn.
Thanks
so much for that, Ray. Look, I just want to go back to Michael Oliver's story. So you said he went and caused other problems in New Vanuatu, but I just want to conclude his Republic of Minerva.
Can I ask one question before you go into that? It sounds to me like he's basically trying to build an artificial version of Wonder Woman's island.
I don't think he was going that far.
But this is what it sounds like to me. Like, why don't you just find that?
Yeah, find that.
Just find that.
I think, he's on a smaller scale. It's probably hard to build an island. So this is Michael Oliver and his backers who started with these coral reefs just below the surface, and so there was some potential legal ambiguity about ownership, because they're not islands. Started with the lumps of coral wrapped in chicken wire and concrete, dumped them in some flags, and then I think, Ray, they did some dredging to bring up some more coral and some more sand and things to make a bit of an island. Yep. The King of Tonga was not super impressed with this. So you can imagine he has just gone through, Tonga itself has just gone through a bit of a decolonization process in just the couple of years before. And then suddenly you see a bunch of rich white libertarians setting up an island in an area that in Tonga they considered part of their territory, or at least some certainly did. So this is King Tupou IV, set out to reassert Tongan sovereignty in May 1972. He got on the royal yacht with a brass band, a flag, and I think a bunch of convicts from the country's jail. I don't know how many jails there are in Tonga. They tore down the flag of the Republic of Minerva, destroyed Oliver's platform that they had built, and then set about themselves building 2 permanent islands on the reefs high above the high water mark, so that there would always be islands and hopefully fewer shipwrecks. He proclaimed them in Tongan Parliament as new islands that would be Tongan property, Teleki Tokelo and Tele Tonga. And that's the end of the Republic of Minerva.
That's the Republic of Minerva.
Did they even live on it?
No.
When
this occurred in the 1970s, other archipelagos in the Southwest Pacific recognized, right, that it was very dangerous to let a project like this happen because there's lots of seamounts and reefs and so on and so forth, and nobody wanted to see a kind of, ocean rush or reef rush or whatever you want to call it. But there subsequently has been a long-standing dispute between Fiji and Tonga around the Minerva reefs and things like fishing rights and things like this. And so there's been an ongoing kind of back and forth around this. I mean, the only permanent fixtures on the reefs are these little platforms with a kind of flag or a beacon on them. And I don't even know if those are still upright. I mean, Oliver's vision was a platform that would eventually house 30,000 people. Oh. I mean, it was this a big city plan, but there's nothing like that. Nobody lives on the reefs or anything like that. No.
I think the agreement there that you can get, even if Fiji and Tonga might dispute, they can probably agree that people from further afield.
We know it's not theirs.
rich white Americans, not theirs. So yeah,
not theirs. That's right.
And I think we can probably think about that for a lot of these projects. That if you're not from there, yeah, maybe don't go and set up a country there.
I want one to work.
That's right.
I want one to work. Yeah. Come on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ray. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Wholesome Show.
Yeah, thanks, Ray.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks for reading the book. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Cheers.